All right, everyone, ready for another deep dive. Today we're going deep into soil health and weeds. Have you ever been to a garden center? Like just overwhelmed by all the fertilizers, all those chemicals? It can make you wonder, right? What if the real secret to a thriving garden is actually understanding those weeds we try so hard to get rid of?
Yeah, it's a whole different way of thinking about it, Like, we always see weeds as the enemy, but maybe they're trying to tell us something, like something about the soil, almost like a little signal that something's off.
Hmm, okay, I like that. So to really dig into this idea, let's imagine two students, okay? Their names are Kesser and Steen. And they're working on a project for their class called Nature and Innovation. Now, Steen's family loves a quick fix, the bigger the better sort of thing. But Kesser is all about the science behind it all.
It's like two sides of the same coin, right? You have Steen, who's all about just adding stuff in, like fertilizer. And then you have Kesser, who wants to figure out how it all works naturally.
Exactly. And we see this when Kesser starts like obsessing over the periodic table, talking about potassium and magnesium, calcium, phosphorus, nitrogen. It's like they're trying to solve a puzzle.
Trying to crack the code of plant nutrition. And actually, that whole phosphorus thing is super interesting because on one hand, it's like crucial for plants to grow, but then there's this whole debate about how it impacts the environment, especially when too much of it ends up in our water.
So maybe those quick fix fertilizers aren't the answer after all, huh?
Yeah.
It makes you think there must be a better way to nourish plants.
Exactly. And Kessler starts to realize that, maybe it's not just about adding more stuff to the soil. Maybe it's also about choosing the right plants, like plants that are better suited for that environment and don't need all that extra stuff.
Now, remember that time Kesser went to the vineyard?
Yeah.
And they used a refractometer.
Yeah. A lot of people think of those for measuring sugar, like in winemaking, but they can actually be used for a lot more than that.
Okay, now I gotta admit, I don't really know what a refractometer is. Can you explain it like I'm 5?
Sure. Basically, it measures how light bends when it passes through a liquid. And that bending, we call that the refractive index. And that can tell us about the stuff dissolved in the liquid.
Okay, so how does that apply to plants?
Well, we can use a refractometer to measure something called the Brix value of plant sap. And that Brix value, it tells us how nutrient-dense the plant is. It's a good way to know how healthy a plant is overall.
So a higher Brix value means healthier plants. And this ties back to the idea that maybe healthy plants, even weeds, can do well without those chemical fertilizers.
Exactly. Kessler starts to understand that those weeds, the ones that grow in the toughest conditions, they might be the key to understanding how to have healthy soil. Think about it. They're growing in places where the soil is packed down, or it's poor quality, or the nutrients are all out of whack. What's their secret?
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing. So we're not just talking about weeds being annoying. They're like telling us what the soil needs.
Exactly. That's the big takeaway here. Healthy soil is the foundation for everything, whether you're gardening or farming. And understanding weeds might be the first step to getting there. Maybe they're not the enemy we thought they were. Maybe they're actually trying to help us out. And the really cool thing is that this idea, it kind of changes how we look at our gardens. Like, we're so focused on having perfect lawns, no weeds in the flower beds, we forget to look at what's happening under the ground.
Yeah, we get so caught up in like the symptoms,
Yeah.
like those annoying weeds, but we don't think about what's actually causing them.
Exactly. And that's where paying attention to the weeds can be so useful. Like, say your lawn is full of dandelions. That's pretty frustrating, right? But those dandelions, they might even be telling you that the soil's packed too tight or that it needs more calcium.
So instead of thinking of dandelions as like the enemy, we should see them as like a warning sign.
Yeah. Like a little flag saying, hey, something's not right here. And each weed, each type, they like different things. So once we understand that, we can start to figure out what's going on with the soil and fix it.
Okay, starting to get it.
Mm-hmm.
But how do we actually go from like understanding those messages to actually doing something?
Well, one way is to be more selective about which weeds we pull. We don't have to get rid of every single one, just the ones that are like really aggressive or the ones we really don't want. It's all about balance, right?
So we're not fighting a war against all weeds, but more like managing them so they can actually help the soil and the other plants we want to grow.
Exactly. And there are other things we can do too, like planting cover crops. Those are plants that we grow specifically to make the soil healthier. They can help keep other weeds down, and they add nutrients to the soil.
So it's like having little helpers in our garden,
Right.
working together to keep everything balanced.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a whole bunch of other organic gardening techniques we can use too, like composting and mulching and switching up what we plant each year. It all helps create a healthy environment where weeds aren't really a big problem anymore. They're more like a sign that things are going well.
This is so cool. We've gone from weeds being the enemy to being like soil detectives. But are people actually doing this in like the real world, like on farms and stuff?
Absolutely. There's a whole movement in farming called regenerative farming. It's all about having healthy soil so we can grow food sustainably.
So instead of constantly fighting nature, they're trying to work with it
Right.
to make the soil healthier.
Yeah, exactly. They do things like planting seeds directly into the soil without tilling it, and they use cover crops to protect the soil between harvests. They use less chemicals, and they try to have lots of different plants and animals, and that makes everything healthier and more productive.
Wow, this is amazing. It really feels like we're changing how we think about soil and plants, and especially weeds. Instead of fighting nature, we're starting to learn from it. But what about regular people? Like, what can we do in our own gardens to make a difference?
Well, the first step is just paying attention. Look at your garden, really see what weeds are growing there, and instead of getting annoyed, try to figure out what they're telling you about the soil. Once you start listening to those messages, you can start fixing the problems.
So we need to become like better listeners,
Yeah.
more aware of what nature's telling us.
Yeah, exactly. And there's so much information out there to help us. Books, websites, you can even join a gardening group. People are happy to share what they know.
So we're listening to the weeds, figuring out what they mean, and then taking action. What are some easy things we can do to make our soil healthier?
Composting is a great way to add good stuff to your soil, and mulching helps keep the moisture in and the weeds down, and switching up what you plant each year can help keep pests away and make sure the soil has all the nutrients it needs.
It sounds like we're not just gardening anymore. It's more like we're part of a team with nature, working together to make everything grow.
Yeah, that's a great way to think about it. When we work with nature, we can create amazing gardens and farms, places that are good for us and good for the planet.
You know, it's really amazing to see how this idea of working with nature is gaining traction. It's like we're blending ancient wisdom with modern science to figure out a better way forward.
Yeah, and actually this shift in thinking, it really aligns with a lot of traditional practices in indigenous cultures. They've known for a long time that everything's connected and that keeping things balanced is key.
Right. It's like we're rediscovering something that's been there all along. Like those indigenous practices have a lot to teach us about how to live in harmony with the planet.
And that brings us back to Kesser and Steen, right? They're starting to see that bigger picture, those bags of fertilizer. They're not just about growing bigger plants, it's a whole system, and it has a big impact on the environment.
Yeah, it's like a wake-up call, right? Even small choices like what fertilizer we use can have a ripple effect way beyond our own backyards.
Totally. And this is so important right now with all the challenges we're facing, like climate change and losing biodiversity and even food shortages. But if we shift to a more holistic way of farming, focusing on soil health and working with nature, we can make things better for everyone.
So what can the average person do? Like if I just want to grow some tomatoes in my backyard, how can I put these principles into practice?
It really starts with just looking around. Observe your garden. Notice the weeds that are growing there. Instead of seeing them as the enemy, try to understand what they're saying about your soil. Once you start seeing them as indicators, you can start fixing those problems.
We need to be more mindful, right? Pay attention to what nature is telling us.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of help out there. There are books, websites, even local gardening groups. People are happy to share their knowledge.
Okay, so we're observing, listening, and then taking action. What are some practical things we can do to make our soil healthier?
Well, composting is a great way to add nutrients and beneficial microbes to your soil. And mulch. Mulch can help retain moisture, suppress those pesky weeds, and even regulate soil temperature. And then there's crop rotation that helps break pest cycles and improve nutrient availability. There are so many options.
It sounds like it's less about battling nature and more about collaborating with it. Instead of trying to control everything, we're learning to work with the natural processes that create healthy soil.
And that change in mindset is huge. When we embrace that collaborative spirit, our gardens and farms can truly thrive. They become spaces that benefit us and the planet.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, haven't we? We started with those bags of fertilizer and ended up exploring the amazing potential of regenerative farming. We learned that weeds might actually be our allies, giving us clues about the health of our soil. And most importantly, we discovered that by embracing a more holistic approach to gardening, we can create a more sustainable and abundant future for everyone.
So next time you see a weed popping up, don't just reach for the herbicide. Take a moment. Observe. Listen, you might be surprised by what you learn.
That's a great thought to leave us with. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Happy gardening.